So everyone can hear me? More or less? Okay, so wonderful. It is really delightful to see all of you here tonight. I mean, so many people who've come out to begin this series on the greatest week in the church's calendar, on Holy Week. So in the back of Krogan Hall, we actually have a syllabus for each of the 4 sessions, which kind of goes through all of the subtopics that we're talking about, as well as a printout of certain things about Palm Sunday itself. And that's just kind of, for you to read, whenever you get around to it. I don't have, usually when I give a class, I give lots of homework. As those of you who took the Vatican II class remembered, it was pretty intense. This, not so much. The way that we're going to approach this is tonight, the first part is about Holy Week in general, and then the second part is specifically about Palm Sunday. And as we go through this, I'm going to be talking about a lot of historical things, some theological things, and some spiritual things. I'm going to be using a lot of terms and a lot of things like that. Again, there won't be a quiz this time during all of this. So some of it is just to kind of get you accustomed to where did all of this stuff that we see and hear in Holy Week come from, and why is it even important? So at a certain point, some of you may be like, oh my gosh, Father, all this history is just incredibly tedious. So get to the fun spiritual stuff. But it's all kind of intertwined because it's kind of in the nature of the beast of what we're doing. Now, because we have 2 major sections tonight for Holy Week and Palm Sunday, I will actually take questions after the Holy Week part and then questions after the Palm Sunday part. Now, I reserve the right to say I'm going to deal with that later, or I plead the fifth on that, or whatever. But again, this is for all of you guys to really be able to enter into Holy Week like you never had before. So that's the whole kind of purpose of all of that this time. Okay, so we're good to go? Okay, wonderful. So let us begin as we begin all good things with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus Christ, as we come into your presence, as we continue this journey of Lent, we ask your blessing upon us as we study the rites and ceremonies of your church during Holy Week. We ask that you may open our minds and our hearts, that we may be moved to love you more and more and appreciate what it is that you do for us in the Paschal mystery. And we ask this in the intercession of our Blessed Lady, who is the Queen of Peace and the Mother of the Eucharist, as we pray. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so before I get started, so my lovely assistant, Ms. Lewis, Erin is here, who will be going through all the different slides and things. Some of it is kind of synchronous with what we're talking about, and some of it's just kind of, fun pictures to look at. So I've given her permission just to kind of go back and forth as seems fine. So don't think that there has to be a one-to-one correspondence between every single thing that I'm talking about and all of that. Okay, does that sound good? Okay. I'm super excited about this class. I've never been so excited about an adult religious education series that I've done, ever. So, Holy Week. What is Holy Week? We believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who is delivered up for our sins and rose again for our justification. That's Romans chapter 4, verse 25. As Christians, the sacred events of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus are not just historical events. They are the gateway through which we must go, that we may be justified from our sins, sanctified by divine grace, and led to eternal friendship with him in heaven. But how do we go through that triumphal gate? Through the life of the church, by our memory of his visible life on earth in the past, union with him in his mysterious presence now, and the expectation of his coming at the end of time. We become partakers of the divine nature by our incorporation into Christ through the 7 sacraments, lived in communion with the visible hierarchical church that has existed since Christ commanded his disciples, "Do this in memory of me." Now, when we talk about those sacraments, okay, we celebrate those sacraments not just kind of willy-nilly, haphazardly, like, I don't wake up one day and say, you know what, I kind of want to do something fun with bread and wine today. I'll get some friends together and we'll do some fun stuff with bread and wine, right? That's not how this works. We celebrate the sacraments in the context of our common worship, the sacred liturgy. There was a Benedictine abbot named Vonier who defines liturgy as, quote, a splendid ceremony. So we're not doing ghetto rites here, right? A splendid ceremony in which nature and grace, art and faith vie with one another in the great effort to express the truth that lies beneath. I think that is a beautiful definition of our common worship as Catholics. By the word celebrate, we mean, quote, to carry out in an assembled community a sacred action in such a way as to express the fullness of its meaning. When we're celebrating something, okay, it's a sacred action, okay? It's not let's get together for a Texas Hold'em convention, right? Okay, it is a sacred action, and it's an action of all of us together, right? It's not just some kind of performance that Father and the altar servers put up on the altar, right? It's a common action to all of us, and we all celebrate the liturgy. And what we celebrate in the sacred liturgy is the Paschal mystery. Okay? What we celebrate in the liturgy is not just that we have some friends and we all kind of believe in Jesus together. That's great, and it's a part of it, but what we celebrate is the Paschal mystery. Okay? And I'm really going to go into some depth about what we mean here. Okay. The word Pasch, or Passover, has its roots in Exodus chapter 12. Okay, remember when God liberates the Hebrews from their Egyptian captivity. The first moment of which is when they smear the blood of lambs on the doorposts so that the angel of death passes over them and spares them from the death of their firstborn sons. Okay, does this all sound familiar to everyone? Okay, Exodus 12. If you haven't read that and know the story, then you have extra homework tonight because it's super fun. Okay, so, and also, none of this that we're doing makes sense without a good knowledge of Exodus 12. Okay, the Jews celebrated at Passover in the Paschal feast the departure from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the wandering in the desert towards the Promised Land. Okay? The entire Exodus event. Now, remember that the Old Testament at a certain point was translated into Greek. This is a translation that we call the Septuagint. And what's interesting is that it renders the word Passover, Pesach, as diabasis. Okay, and you're thinking, oh, Father, not all this Greek nonsense, right? So, no, we got to do some of it because it's super important. Diabasis means passing through, rather than hyperbasis, a passing over, to indicate that it's more than just the angel passing over, but the chosen people passing through. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Now, the earliest Christians, from the letter to the Hebrews forward, remember that we attribute the letters to the Hebrews to St. Paul. Most biblical scholars say that we can't really say that, but for the purposes of this class, we'll call it Paul's letters to the Hebrews. They saw their baptism into the saving death of Christ as the definitive exodus from death to life. So the unity of events of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, which are lived in the Christian through the sacraments in the life of the church, constitute the Paschal mystery par excellence. What the Paschal mystery is not just a bunch of random events in the last few days of Jesus' life, but how we enter into them through the sacraments. And we have our own Exodus event through them. The church intensifies the sense of the sacred for her children throughout the year. Okay? Now, all days are holy, right? Because they're all created by God. And so every day, so you can't say, oh, Mondays, forget that. That's not holy, right? So some of us may think that when we hit the snooze button the 3,000th time. Not that I've ever done that, right? But all days are holy because they are created by God. But certain days are set apart as what we call solemnities. Now, you'll see on the syllabus, I mentioned a book which is really super hard to find. I'm sorry, but unfortunately it hasn't been reprinted that I'm aware of yet. There's a liturgical theologian who is a Benedictine monk named Jean Gaillard, and he talks about solemnities and defines them as, quote, feast celebrated annually and with splendor. Okay, so I think we may have on the next slide Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, feast celebrated annually, okay, and with splendor. See, we got the little fun spinny wheel, the wheel of liturgical fortune, right? Okay, so we got it there. Now, so the Latin solemnitas, okay, in English, when we hear the word solemn, we think of someone who's just very dour and solemn and sad. And then we hear the Catholic Church's solemn liturgy. They're like, oh God, who wants to be part of that? This is all like sad-faced people, you picture the Monty Python thing with people la 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 and they're hitting their heads with something. That's the idea of solemn, right? The Latin solemnitas translates the Greek word erte, which in turn translates two Greek words for feast and exultant joy. Okay? That is not what we think of with the English word solemn, is it? Feast and exultant joy. Easter becomes the solemnity of solemnities, which is why St. Leo the Great refers to it as the Paschal Sacrament, the supreme sacrament of divine mercy. Now, the sacraments possess inherent power. Okay? Remember, the sacraments are not just mere human actions, right? I remember being in the seminary and doing a mission in a parish once, and we were talking about baptism. And there was a guy who said, oh yeah, that's when you take the baby to the church for a bath. And his girlfriend, Neil, said, were you born in Saudi Arabia? What's wrong with you? So, because again, that's all that he thought of. This is just take the baby to church for a bath. Okay, well, it's more than that, right? The sacraments possess inherent power. And the Eucharist is Christ's sacrifice at all times. But think about how many Catholics, have gone to Mass 1,000 times, and then you're like, well, it obviously seems to do too much for you, right? You don't seem to live like anybody else, right? And so some people say, well, if that's what Catholicism is about, then, well, obviously, it ain't doing much for you, so how's it going to do anything for me, right? Have you ever heard that? Or you may have thought that. Well, think about how the sacraments, in and of themselves, are the action of Christ. There's nothing lacking in the sacraments. But their efficacy in us is increased when the faithful are better disposed, right? This is why, you've heard me say, particularly with the school children, right? Mass is not a spectator sport, right? You have to be engaged in it. And the way that we engage is all kinds of different ways, interior, exterior, all of that. From the point of view of grace received, the presence of the redeeming mystery is more actual and more intensely lived. That is why this class is so important. Okay? By inspiring our fellow Catholics to understand the Paschal mystery better, by active, conscious participation, because in doing so, it can really bring you deeper into the divine life. I know that sometimes people get very irritated when, I spend a lot of time teaching at Mass in the homily or the announcements on very specific things about the liturgy. And the reason for that is that I think when we truly understand these things, the Mass comes alive. It's not just something that, we check off a box and we're like, okay, well, I guess if I'm going to get to heaven, I got to kind of, punch my time card, right? It's more of entering into this mystery in a way in which it becomes more efficacious and more alive for us. Holy Week bridges two different sets of 2-week periods. And this is where you kind of see this on the board. Those of you who are on this side of the room, don't worry about this. I'll explain it. In the ancient Roman liturgy, Passiontide begins on the 5th Sunday of Lent. Right? Remember when we go into church and we see everything veiled, right? Historically, that was the time of Passion, kind of the season within the season of Lent called Passiontide. And it intensifies our attention to the death of Christ. such that the first day of Holy Week, remember we've got 2 weeks here, first day of Holy Week is the second Sunday of the Passion. But Holy Week is also one event with the week after, which is called Bright Week, or the Easter Octave. Okay? So the whole fortnight, the whole 2-week period, is known as Paschalia Solemnia, okay? The Paschal Solemnities. Now, when we talk about the Mass, we always have to go back to what do the books that the rites and ceremonies and prayers are contained, what do they say? Okay? Because sometimes we don't think to look at it because we're like, I'm just here to pray and to love Jesus. I mean, I'm not paying attention to all that. But when we do, there's lots of interesting things that come to the fore. The liturgical books call Holy Week Hebdomina Major, the Great Week. Now, in the Middle Ages, among the people, because remember, you have, official church land speak, right? And then you have how people kind of understand it and live it in their own lives. In the Middle Ages, in many places, this week was known as Hebdomina Penosa, okay? The painful week. And for 2 reasons. First of all, because of the sufferings of Jesus meditated upon in the week, as well as the fatigue that we physically experience by participating fully in the ceremonies. Let me tell you, if you've never done all of the ceremonies of Holy Week, then you better get prepared because you're going to be exhausted. And when the A word, right? Hallelujah, hallelujah. When that comes back, you're going to be like, oh, thank you, Jesus, all that is over. Thank you for rising from the dead. You're going to be so happy and exhausted with a happiness like you've never had before, right? Because Holy Week, if you do it right, you're going to be tired, and it's going to be awesome. Okay, so Palm Sunday serves as the overture to this grand drama of Holy Week, whose 3 following days are generally just kind of normal liturgical days, right? There's nothing really different about it. But the center of the week is the Paschal Triduum. Okay, Triduum, 3 days. Okay, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Okay, and those will be for our next classes. Okay, now, here we got to get into some history, because before we talk about all the stuff that we see and hear and experience during Holy Week, remember, we got to know where it comes from and why it's there. Now, I'm a liturgy nerd, so I find all of this intensely fascinating. Some of you may be like, I don't really care. Okay, but you signed up for the class, so we're going to get through it together. In the year 335, the Emperor Constantine, we all know who Constantine is, right? Roman Emperor, legalized Christianity, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so he erected a complex of buildings over the sites that Christians had been visiting since the time of Christ, associated with his passion, death, and resurrection. Now, it's now known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it was originally known as the Anastasis. Okay? And the way the liturgy was practiced there is often known as the Jerusalem Rite. Okay? Now, when I talk about rite, R-I-T-E, I'm talking about a particular way of doing worship, okay, that has kind of boundaries around it, right? There's not the Christopher Smith rite, okay, although some people may say that there is. There are particular rites, particular families of the way that we do things, and we got to understand kind of what these are to understand where all these things came from. Now, a pilgrim named Egeria lived in Jerusalem from 381 to 384, and left detailed accounts of the processions and ceremonies of the time carried out by the Bishop of Jerusalem, St. Cyril. And it really does appear, at least if Egeria is our guide, that the Christians of Jerusalem and pilgrims, because remember, people were already coming from all the parts of the known world, the known Christian world, to the Holy Land to celebrate Easter there. It really does appear that they spent day and night in church during this time. Okay, they weren't going home or going to work. I mean, they were in church the whole of Holy Week, at least if Egeria is our guide to this. And many of the impressive ceremonies that are part of our Roman liturgical tradition. Okay? Because remember, there's lots of liturgical traditions out there, but they're not necessarily Roman. Because we celebrate in the Roman Rite, that's where we're focusing on that. Okay, but with reference to some other things. A lot of these things are directly inspired by how the Paschal mystery was celebrated in Jerusalem already in the 4th century. Now, okay, we talked about these different families of liturgical traditions in the church, which are known as rites, R-I-T-E-S. Now, some have just disappeared in history. Okay? Some have been absorbed into other rites. The liturgical tradition as practiced by the papal court and in the basilicas of Rome, the big churches of Rome, is known as the Roman or the Latin rite. Latin from the liturgical language, Roman because it's the city of Rome. Okay? Now, there are several uses that are based on the Roman rite, but are not strictly Roman. We're going to talk about some of those in this class. And one of the things that, if you look at all these different families of rites, one of the things that comes to the fore is really interesting, is that the Roman rite is incredibly austere and sober in comparison with all the other ones. How many of you have ever been to like a Greek Orthodox church or something? Okay. It does not look like us, does it? Okay. So it's very florid, it's very elaborate. The Roman tradition is very austere in comparison. Now, it's not as austere as like a Quaker meeting where you just kind of sit there and wait for the Holy Ghost to inspire you. It's not quite that austere. But compared with most of the rites of the church, it's a whole different thing. There was an English liturgist named Adrian Fortescue who explains, quote, "The old pure Roman rite was nothing if not austerely practical. It contained no ceremonies done for their own sake, no decorative or symbolic features as do the Eastern rites. Nothing could be wider of the mark than the common Protestant idea that our liturgy is made up of theatrical effects, that we deliberately hold gorgeous ceremonies to impress people's imagination. The exact opposite is true. The Roman tradition, in its exceeding common sense, it's even dull." This is one of the most famous liturgists ever. This is his kind of read on it. Now, the characteristic sobriety of the Roman rite is a bit relaxed during Holy Week. The impressive ceremonies of Palm Sunday find their origin in the same Jerusalem rite witnessed by Egeria 16 centuries ago. The other impressive ceremonies that we see were gradually absorbed in the Roman liturgy from over the Alps as a family of rites called Gallican, okay, G-A-L-L-I-C-A-N, because of their composition in the Frankish kingdoms. Okay, so we're talking about what we call basically modern-day France. The Gallican influence on Holy Week is considerable, and some of the most colorful elements of Holy Week are actually Gallican and not Roman in origin, even if the texts of many of the prayers preserve the ancient Roman tradition. Now, we're talking about this gradual Gallicanization of the Holy Week liturgy in the Roman rite already happened by the early Middle Ages. Remember in 1570, okay, Pope St. Pius V comes along, and he's seeing Christendom divided all over the place with Protestants of various stripes, wars of religion, all this craziness happening. And he said that any liturgy which was less than 200 years old had to be scrapped, and you had to adopt the Roman rite. And he encouraged everybody, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, why don't you just do it like we do here in Rome? Okay. So there was a great centralization of the liturgy after 1570, where most everybody in the Latin West kind of almost spontaneously adopted what was happening in Rome. This was not the case in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, you could have had, gone to Mass in Taylor's and gone to Mass in Charleston or in Pumpkintown and had certain very fascinating variations. Under Pius V, he's like, no, we need to have unity as Catholics. We're all going to do it like we do here in the papal basilicas. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is, even when Pius V did this in 1570, and when he kind of expunged other things which he thought were kind of late accretions from the liturgy, Holy Week, he just left. He was like, Holy Week, not going to touch it. Okay, Holy Week is going to stay the way that it is. And as the late 19th century spawned the liturgical movement, which sought to increase people's understanding of the symbolism, theology, and history of the liturgy, calls for reform became clearer. In 1951, Pope Pius XII, on his own initiative, brought about the first of what will be numerous reforms to Holy Week. Now, when we hear this, it kind of is really strange to us. But for many centuries, all of the ceremonies of Holy Week were done in the morning, because Mass was never allowed to be celebrated after noon. Okay, why do you think that would be?
You couldn't eat.
Okay, you couldn't eat, the fast, right? So the fast was from midnight until communion. And you can have water, you can have food, you can have nothing, right? And it had been that way, again, since kind of time immemorial. Well, Pius XII is looking at a situation in which, what about workers who were on third shift? Okay, when these fasting rules were put into place, you didn't have all of that, right? So the world had changed. And so the Pope wanted to kind of say, okay, people live in an entirely different kind of reality, so the church's discipline kind of needs to reflect some of that. So, but before that, Mass was any liturgical service that was Eucharistic in character was done in the morning. Now, this led to kind of an anomalous situation in which the Easter Vigil, okay, remember when we started the Easter Vigil, we had the big new fire outside? That's kind of the iconic image of the Easter Vigil, was usually celebrated around 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so imagine going into a church where there's sunlight all over the place. Light of Christ. I can't even see the bloody candle, right? Because it was 10 o'clock in the morning, right? Now, it had lost entirely much of its symbolism, as well as its character as an all-night vigil. Remember, Ajuria and her friends, they were in church all night long for the Easter Vigil, okay? So with the Easter Vigil at 10 o'clock in the morning, we'd kind of lost a lot of the sense of what all this was really about. The 1951 time change of the Easter Vigil was followed by what has to be the first substantial revision of liturgical books in Roman history. Remember that the church, up until the middle of the 20th century, always did things pretty organically and piecemeal. But then in the 1950s, lots of people were calling for, let's kind of look at this. So lots of committees and stuff and changes began to happen very rapidly. In 1955, Pius XII issued what is called the Ordo Hebdomade Sancte Restauratus, which drastically simplifies Holy Week. Some people would say gutted it like a fish. And it changes the times of the services to the times that we know today. Okay? With the Mass of the Lord's Supper in the evening. Okay? People used to joke and call it the Mass of the Lord's Breakfast. Right? Good Friday, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, during this class, we will refer often to the pre-Pius XII version of the ancient Franco-Roman liturgy, the Pian Reform, so I'll call it the 1955 thing. We'll also refer to an even more thorough simplification and reform that was accomplished by Paul VI as a part of a new edition of the Missale Romanum, issued in 1969. And that's what we refer to as the Novus Ordo, or the ordinary form of the Roman Rite. Okay? So most Catholics in the West, 98% of Catholics, go to the ordinary form of the Roman Rite. That's the 1969 Missal. But again, to know where we are now, we got to know where we came from as well. So in this parish, we celebrate the extraordinary form, and we go back and forth between the last edition of the extraordinary form, which is 1962, but some of the pre-55 rites we observe here as well. Okay, so that's my Holy Week part. Okay, so are we okay up until now? Okay. Any particular things that come that aren't related to specific questions about the days of Holy Week? And we can wait until the end. You might have some more things at the end. So, okay, wow. Okay, everything is clear. That's fantastic. Okay, so ready for Palm Sunday? This is like my favorite day. I love Palm Sunday. Okay, so Holy Week begins with joy as we commemorate Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Okay, here's Pope Benedict with his cardinal deacons. Look at that. Now that's a palm, isn't it? So, I love that. So if any of you want to make one of those for me for Palm Sunday, you're welcome to do so. No. In ancient times, the day was known as the Pascha of Flowers, and is still known in Spanish countries as La Pascua Florida. since flowers as well as palms and olive branches were blessed. Now, the Liturgy of Palm Sunday comprises two distinct services, the blessing of the palms and the Eucharist. Both have their own proper tonality. In the first, the dominant note is one of joy and triumph. In the second, we hear Christ pleading yet confident prayer in his bitter combat. The two are linked by the procession, which presents to us the meeting of the church with Christ in the sacred mysteries. And it foretells the entry at last of the faithful into the eternal Jerusalem, the celestial city, the kingdom of heaven. So when we celebrate Palm Sunday, it's not just about, oh, well, Jesus kind of rode in on a donkey 2,000 years ago. It's about us going into heaven. Think about that when you're, waving your palm on Palm Sunday. Very different kind of thing there. The Jerusalem rite for Palm Sunday came to Rome via Gaul. The Romans would gather, I think, is it the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool. So, no, it's fine. Yeah, I'm going like a turbine engine here. The Romans would gather in the church of San Silvestro, and a cardinal would bless the palms, whereas the clergy would go over to the Lateran Basilica. So you can see San Silvestro inside and out there. Whereas the clergy would go over to the Lateran Palace, which is where the Pope lived at the time. Remember that the cathedral of the Pope is actually St. John Lateran. It's not St. Peter's, which some people think, right? And they would receive their palms from the hand of the Pope. Then the people who had been at San Silvestro, they start walking, okay? And then the clergy, because usually they tend to be kind of old and decrepit. So they kind of go from the Lateran Basilica around the corner, from the palace into the basilica, and the two processions kind of meet up. The procession would go to the Cathedral Church of Rome, St. John Lateran, where the Pope would celebrate the Mass. Because remember, when we talk about the Roman liturgy, we're talking about really what the Pope does. That's the characteristic of what makes the Roman liturgy Roman, the papal court, and what they did. Now, since Pius XII, the first part of the liturgy consists of a blessing of palms, the reading of a gospel account related to the palms, and a procession. Okay? Yellow, that's it. Okay. Before that, okay. Now, here we go. The blessing of palms actually takes place in the context of what is called a missa secca. Have you ever heard this term before? Okay, this is new. Okay, or a dry mass. This is something which seems very strange to us. When a seminarian is learning how to say Mass, obviously he has to go through the mechanical action so he knows what to do on the day that he's ordained. Right? But obviously, he ain't ordained, so he's not doing nothing to bread and wine. Right? And so out of reverence, obviously, the seminarian isn't going to sit there over a host and say, this is my, just out of reverence. But what that's called is a dry Mass. It's like a dry run for Mass. But in the Middle Ages, it was also very common for people to pray the prayers of the Mass as a devotion. Now, of course, they weren't making bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, but it was a dry Mass, as opposed to a non-dry Mass, where you have a chalice filled with wine. Okay. Now, the Missa Secca. Scholars are divided as to whether the Jerusalem rite, remember we're going back to the beginning, had the people gather into church in Bethany for a Mass in which the palms were blessed, and then process to the Anastasis in Jerusalem for another Mass. Okay, that's option one. Okay, or whether the medieval custom of devotional services that mimic the Mass, without the consecration of bread and wine, drove the structure of the blessing in the classical Roman rite. Okay, so we see there's two options. We're not quite sure what really was the case. Does that make sense? Okay. The old Missa Secca, there we go, awesome, begins with the antiphon, Hosanna Filio David, whose joyful cry opens up this solemn occasion. And we're going to listen to two versions of it. One is the chant in Latin, obviously, and then the other is an English setting, which was done by Orlando Gibbons, both of which we sing in this church on Palm Sunday. So if you haven't heard it before, so we'll do the first two there. That's the chant one. Hosanna to the Son of David. Okay, and here is the English one, just so you know the English words that go with it. It's a beautiful setting.
72% of remaining smokers come from lower income communities. And it's not
Father, you want me to just play it? You want to play through the app?
Oh, yeah, that's fine. So.
Okay.
coincidence.
YouTube and commercialism trying to destroy Holy Week. It's the demon. Because I really like this so much, and it is the beginning of Palm Sunday. We got another one by Thomas Wheel, so that'll be the next one. Yeah. That's Holy Week, my friends. Isn't that super cool? I can listen to this all over the place. So, that's the entrance to the Missa Sica on Palm Sunday. Then follow a collect. You know how we have the opening prayer of the Mass that collects the theme of the Mass, as it were. We have a collect, an epistle, a gradual, a tract, and the Gospel of the Palms from Matthew 21. Then there's a type of offertory prayer. The singing of the preface dialogue. Remember, it said, "The Lord be with you." Lift up your hearts. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. Okay, there is the preface dialogue, and then a preface, and then the Sanctus, just like at Mass, holy, holy, holy. There follows the consecratory canon, with 5 blessings of palm or olive. The priest sprinkles and incenses the branches, and then they are distributed to the faithful as the choir sings the antiphon, Pueri Hebreorum. So the children of the Hebrews went with palms and olives. So we're going to listen to that. So Pueri Hebreorum. This is the chant, because again, the chant was written for the Roman liturgy specifically. Each person comes to the railing where they kiss the blessed palm and then the back of the hand of the celebrant, who gives it to them as a sacramental. The idea is that sacramentals come from the altar, which is a symbol of Christ. And because the priest's hands are consecrated and set apart for blessing, then when we receive a blessed thing from the altar, you kiss the blessed thing, the sacramental, as well as the hand of Christ, from whom you receive the sacramental. After the priest washes his hands, because you can imagine after, lots of ladies in the lipstick and all that fun stuff, then, the hand looks not like it did when you began it, and sings another prayer. The deacon sings, Procedamus in pace, let us go forth in peace. And the people sing, In nomine Christi, Amen. In the name of Christ, Amen. So the melodies are a little bit different in the Latin than the English. Now, during the procession, that's right, okay, yeah, so you see the palms there. During the procession, the people sing 6 antiphons until they get to the church door. Inside the church are 2 cantors who open the door at a certain point when the subdeacon, because remember in the ancient liturgy you have the priest, the deacon, and the subdeacon. Okay, the subdiaconate was kind of put into abeyance since 1974 by Paul VI. At a certain point, the subdeacon strikes the church door with the foot of the processional cross. Just takes the thing into bang, bang, bang. Okay? And then the door is open. While this whole thing in front of the door is going on, there is a hymn, Gloria Laus. And we're going to talk a lot about this hymn because it is super cool. I just like it. It's one of those iconic things of Palm Sunday. So we're going to listen to the Latin version of Gloria Laus. This is a bit too slow for me. Israel let's see what the next one over is, because I think I put 2 in there for some reason. I don't remember why I put the other one in there. Let's see what that one is. Yeah, let's just, is that the same thing? Let's just check it out.
You want to take this out?
Yeah. Oh, this is the second text. Okay, okay, awesome. Okay, so that is the Gloria Laus. As the church doors are flung open, the people sing the antiphon Ingrediente Domine, so the Lord entering into the temple. Okay, so you have a sense of how the old Missa Sica of Palm Sunday, it's a long thing. I mean, when we do it here, it's about 45 minutes. Okay, when we do the ordinary form, it's about 5. Okay, so we're talking about a significant, change there. So, how has the blessing of the palms changed? Today, we still have, remember the antiphon, Hosanna Filio David. Okay, still got that going on. We have an exhortation about how our Lenten journey is ended. The Palm Gospel from Matthew in year A, from Mark in year B, and Luke in year C, because remember that in the ordinary form we have this 3-year cycle on Sundays. And only 1 prayer of blessing. So we've gone from 5 prayers of blessing to 1. The palms are generally distributed to people before Mass. Usually, you just kind of, pick your palm up as you're going into church, right? Who hold them in place for the blessing instead of receiving them as a sacramental from the altar. Now, another thing which is interesting, did you notice the color? Let's go back a couple. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect. This is great. Okay, see how we have here on the left, we talk about the subdeacon in front of the door while the Gloria Laus is going on. Okay. Then you see us doing that last year. There's Father Tomlinson, who's helping us out. So you see us before the door, and then above is where all the Missa Sica is going on, which we do in Krogan Hall before we do the procession. Okay. Go back one more for a sec. Okay, and then forward. Sorry. Okay, I'm an idiot. Okay. Okay, notice. Okay, perfect. Now go back again. See that we have 2 different colors, right? Okay, so what's the dealio here? Okay, so in the pre-1955 rite, the color of the blessing, procession, and palms was purple because it was part of Passion Time. In 1955, Pius XII changed the blessing and procession to red to emphasize the triumphal nature of the entry of Christ and the foreshadowing of his martyrdom. And then the Mass changed to purple. You can imagine this was a sacristan's nightmare because you're going to change the altar frontal, the tabernacle veil. There's all this. You've got to take off all the vestments. You've got to put on not only just more vestments, but an entirely different color of vestments. You've got to take everything off and put it on again. Paul VI, who had been the Archbishop of Milan previous to his election to the papacy, changed the color of everything to red. Since in the Ambrosian Rite, celebrated in Milan, all of Holy Week was traditionally celebrated in red. Now, let's go. Yeah, no, we can say all that. Okay. Before 1955, the processional cross, the big cross that we carry at the head of the procession, was veiled in purple. In 1955, it was veiled in red, and the striking of the church door by the subdeacon with it was suppressed. In 1962, the veil was taken off the cross and a palm attached to it. In 1969, the palm attached to the cross was dropped. Okay. So you see that even with just the processional cross, there's a lot of stuff that went on in a very short period of time. In 14 years, we went through 4 different changes of what this was supposed to look like. Okay, so another word about vesture. Okay, so let's go back one. Yeah, okay, so look at the picture on the left. Okay, this is a church called Santissima Trinità dei Pellegrini in Rome. And this is a church which does the pre-1955 Holy Week. And when I was a seminarian, I used to serve Mass here. And just in the beginning when they were starting all this stuff. So this is how I know about all of this, is by going to this church. They do a really, really beautiful job. And notice that, it's Passiontide, so it's a veil. Actually, you know what? That's a lie. That's actually a picture of the Easter Vigil at a certain point. Don't worry about it, because what I want to show you is see what the priest, deacon, and subdeacon are wearing. You've got the priest on the top step, the deacon, and then the subdeacon. It all looks the same, doesn't it? Okay. It doesn't look like what a deacon normally wears, right? So, okay, we're going to talk about that, because this is super important. The deacon and subdeacon at Mass normally wear what is called the dalmatic and the tunicle. The Dalmatic was introduced by Pope Sylvester, who reigned from the year 314 to 335. And according to a letter of St. Gregory the Great, the tunicle was widespread by the 6th century. The Dalmatic and tunicle are long outer garments with sleeves. Originally, the tunicle had narrower sleeves and one clavis, or ornamental crossbar, on the back, while the Dalmatic had wider sleeves and 2 clavis. Although, very soon the distinction was just kind of, it disappeared early on. And the prayers that the deacon and subdeacon say when vesting refer to them as vestments of joy. I mean, they're called the Dalmatic and the tunicle of joy. Now, what about putting a garment with sleeves on is particularly joyful? I don't know, but that was the symbolism that was attached to it. Okay, so it was common at Rome, because they were vestments of joy, to omit them on penitential days. Now, okay, what is the outer garment that the priest wears at the Mass? The chasuble, that's right, okay. Here's something you may be kind of shocked by, because deacons wear the dalmatic, subdeacons wear the tunicle, very fixed garment with the order pretty early on. The chasuble, not so much. It wasn't actually reserved for ecclesiastics of any kind until the 6th century. And it wasn't until the late Middle Ages that it was reserved for the priest alone. At Rome, it became common for deacon and subdeacon to wear a chasuble folded up in the front. It's called the planeta plicata. Let's go forward a couple of things. Yes, okay, so you can't see the front of it. Go one further, one forward. Okay, no, go backwards. I picture the front. You'll see it on Holy Saturday again, because we'll come back again. Anyway, so folded up in the front on purple and black days. And then the deacon would take it off. See how in the bottom picture there, that on the right, he doesn't have it on, right? He has on this, it's like a stole that the deacon wears, but it's bigger. It's called the stola larga. Now, in 1955, Pius XII ended the use of the black folded chasuble for Good Friday, and St. John the 23rd ended the use of the purple folded chasuble for Advent, Lent, and other penitential days. One of the interesting things is that just within the last couple of years, folded chasubles have come back with a vengeance. It's very strange. Places that are doing the extraordinary form have just kind of spontaneously all over the world just gone back to folded chasubles. It's a very interesting thing. Because again, I think the idea is, wait a minute, if the dalmatic and tunicle are supposed to be about joy, then why are we wearing them on penitential days? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So the Church of Santissima Trinità, for example, has the folded chasubles for the deacon and subdeacon. Now, all of that to say, we're talking about colors and vesture. There's a lot of that in this class because, again, there's all kinds of interesting symbolism involved. When we talked about the hymn, Gloria Laus, okay, remember we talked about that in front of the church door. Gloria Laus et honor tibi Rex Christe Redemptor. This is like the iconic procession hymn, just as the Hosanna Filio David was kind of, that is the iconic entrance to Holy Week and Palm Sunday. The Gloria Laus, this is like really super cool, I think this is fun, was written by Theodore of Orleans in 820. And almost universally in the English-speaking world, we still sing it in procession. Now some of you are thinking, I've never heard that. Yes, you have, just in English. It was done, there was an 1861 translation by an Anglican priest named John Mason Neal. And now we know it as All Glory, Laud, and Honor. So we're going to listen to the All Glory, Laud, and Honor to the Redeemer King. We're going to listen to two versions of it. Oh, that's actually the one that we do here. Okay. Oh, I got the thing wrong. Okay. Let's see. Well, let's do this one. This is the one that we do here. The one that you probably don't know the melody to because we just started doing it a couple of years ago. But it's actually more based on the chant melodies. Yeah, just go ahead and listen to that.
If you write anything on your computer,
I write pretty much all day, every day, and Grammarly makes my writing.
It sounds kind of like your chant, but it's obviously English. I wonder, let's try, see where it says, all glory, love, and honor, diocese of St. Benedict, which is above the, I am becoming Catholic. This one. Let's just see if this is the one, the melody different.
Bring your code.
Yeah, let's just try it. What could possibly go wrong? That's right, karaoke with Father Chris. So, all glory, laud, and honor, that melody is called St. Theodulf, okay? And it's from 1613. So, when we're singing that particular hymn tune, we're singing a 19th century English translation to a 17th century Lutheran German hymn tune. So, it's still pretty cool music. All of these different things are all really, really beautiful renditions of the same text. Now, where did the text come from? Here's the fun part. Theodulf of Orleans was in prison in Angers for conspiring against the king. And so at a certain point, the Palm Sunday procession starts, and it goes by the prison, and the king, who happened to be St. Louis the Pious, was walking by, and then all of a sudden he hears this prisoner, who is the Bishop of Orleans, who he put in prison for conspiring against him, who just starts singing this. Gloria laus et honor tibi sit. And the king's like, whoa, that's cool. Who's singing that? Oh, the dude you put in prison. Oh, well, maybe he needs to get out of prison because that's some good stuff, right? So, Louis the Pious was moved so that he released the traitorous bishop and turncoat on the spot. So, mental note, when you get put in prison, sing some good stuff and get you out. Now, I don't know if the Greenville County Police Department would quite go for that if I started singing Gloria Laus as they go by. But anyway, so, now, no matter, we talk about the colors and the vesture and all that kind of stuff. From a certain point of view, it doesn't really matter. No matter what color it is and what these people have on, the Mass part of it, remember we talked about there's two different parts of the liturgy. The Mass plunges us into the suffering of Christ, making a stark contrast to the triumphal tone of the procession. Okay? Think about how you cannot hear the words of Psalm 22. My God, why have you abandoned me? Yep. Or the track, Deus meus, vade mere legisti. You can't hear that. It doesn't matter the melody of the text without realizing, okay, wow, we're in a different universe. And it just happens like that. This procession's over, bam, into it. The prayers of the rest of the Mass were fixed in Rome in the 8th century. Okay, they just kind of, kept on since then. Now, on Palm Sunday, the narrative of the passion, death, and burial of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew was always read until 1969. Then we have Matthew year A, Mark year B, Luke year C. Before 1962, the Passion Gospels of Mark and Luke were read on Tuesday and Wednesday of Holy Week, respectively. Okay? So a lot of people who didn't, unless they went to daily Mass, they just never heard the accounts of Mark and Luke. So they just kind of missed them. Which is one of the reasons why the liturgical reform said, okay, well, let's just kind of mix them all on Sunday up a little bit so that people who only go to Mass on Sundays can hear those accounts. The Gospel is proclaimed. Remember how when we have the Gospel on a normal Sunday, we have incense and acolytes with candles that accompany it, right? Not on Palm Sunday, because it's kind of a narration of the Passion rather than a gospel proper. So the deacon does not ask for a blessing. Now, it is traditional for 3 deacons to sing the Passion according to 3 different voices. the chronista. Okay, you see the three deacons there. Okay. The chronista or narrator in a baritone voice. The synagogue or people in a tenor voice. And the Christus, the Christ, in a bass voice. Okay. One of the weirdest liturgical experiences I've ever had was being in a church. I had been ordained a priest just a year, and the guy who was going to sing the synagogue, the high part, wasn't able to sing at the last minute. So I had to sing both the low part and the high part. I know that people had to think, what's up with like the schizophrenic priest here? He's like singing la 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 la. The things we do for obedience. So, in some places where the narrative had more than one person speaking, when we all yell together, crucify him, crucify him. It's really sad when people get really into that. But anyway, in some places it was sung by a choir called the turba, which is just the Latin for the crowd. The clergy and the people hold the palm branches from the procession over their heart with their left hand. Okay, so when you're in church on Palm Sunday, remember to do that, because I'm doing it and you can too. That's the old tradition. So, now remember how, okay, so going back to last Holy Week, remember at a certain point Jesus dies, and then we just stop in silence for a second. Okay. Pre-1955, something interesting would happen. After the silence succeeding the words referring to Jesus as breathing his last, since 1955, the chronista sings the rest of the Passion in the same tone. But before then, before 55, the chronista would stop, ask for a blessing, and then sing the rest of the passage according to what is called the planctus, or the weeping tone. Now, to give you a sense of kind of what this sounds like, let me see if I can find this. I'm not going to sing the entire Passion, don't worry. Okay, so, well, that's Mark, so I should probably get to the right one. Okay, so this is how the chronista, the narrator, kind of starts this off. And it's basically the same thing over and over and over again for his part. Okay. Passio Domini nostri Iesu Christi, secundum Matteum, in illo tempore, dixit Iesus discipulis suis. Okay, and that just kind of, that melody goes over and over again. Well, after our Lord dies on the cross, we have the weeping tone. And then all of a sudden, that pretty straightforward, simple narration tone that we hear, the Gospel of Matthew is really super long, isn't it? Okay. All of a sudden changes to Alter autem die, vespos parasceven, convenerunt principes sacerdotum et Pharisei, ad Pilatum dicentes, Domine recordati sumus, quia seductor ire dixit ad huc vivens, pos res dies resurgens. And it keeps going on like this until the very end. Simiantes lapidem cum custodibus. That's the end of the Passion. In 1955, all of this part is sung according to the same tone. So it just kind of ends like, sedentes contra sepulchrum. Why? Okay, so, but that's the history of it. Now, let's listen to, we have a version of the Planctus in English. Prince of Peace is probably one of the only places that in the ordinary form of the Roman Rite, in English, sings the Planctus tone. Not by doing all the ritual actions, we just sing it because I just can't listen to that. I just can't. Okay, so here's a very, I hope the person never hears this, but it's really singing it. But it's in English, so let's listen to it. Yeah, yeah, straight for the, yeah, there we go.
For this happened so that the scripture passage might be fulfilled.
Okay. So you're hearing the normal narrative. And then it goes into the English Planctus.
And again another passage says, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea secretly Jesus, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate if he could remove the body of Jesus, and Pilate permitted it.
So this whole symbol of wailing. Think about the women who are weeping over Jerusalem. The sound. What does that sound like in music, according to the tonal system? It's an absolutely stunning thing. Now, where did this Planctus thing come from? Because it's super cool. Remember how we talked about Louis the Pious, the King of France? Louis the Pious introduced it into his private chapel, and from there, other people heard this when they were, in the private chapel of the king, because they kept doing it, because, who doesn't want to listen to that? It's wonderful. Until it was adopted in Rome in the 14th century. In 1955, it just wasn't printed anymore. It was just printed according to the normal narration tone. And one of the most iconic musical expressions of the Passion Gospel tradition in chant was lost. In 1969, the other change is that the non-ordained could participate in the Passion as well. Because remember, before you had 3 deacons, right? So now you can have a layperson as a narrator during the Passion, okay? Which is also super helpful when you're trying to sing the Passion and your priest can't sing. So this can be a good thing. So, and you see in the pictures, the top picture is from the Brompton Oratory in London. That is actually a Novus Ordo Mass, but with 3 priests who are singing the Passion because they have enough priests who can sing. That's super cool. And in the bottom is Santissima Trinita again, and this is the extraordinary form on Palm Sunday, because you can see that they've got the purple stoles on with the books that they're carrying in procession that have the Passion Gospel. Now, Palm Sunday in the Roman liturgical tradition is already an impressive dramaturgical event. There's a lot of cool stuff going on here. Now, even though this class is about the Roman tradition, it is really hard not to mention some of the more colorful traditions that emerged under Gallican influence elsewhere, all of which have disappeared. In many places, people would gather at the highest point of the city. And remember that before you could actually buy on the internet your palms and have them FedEx to you from Florida, that wasn't the case for most of Christian history. So in northern Europe, it was very often they would use boxwood or pussy willows, okay? Because, think about even in Greenville, you couldn't get palms, back in the day. Now, in the Mediterranean, palms were woven. Let's go forward one, maybe. Oh, that's the end. Okay, well, we can go wherever. Palms were woven into large, elaborate compositions and tied with ribbons, especially for the clergy. In most processions, a certain image was chosen to represent Christ. In France, a gospel book. In Italy, a great crucifix veiled and wreathed in green branches. In Germany, a statue of Christ on a wooden donkey driven on a float. In England and Normandy, the Blessed Sacrament was carried in procession. And at Augsburg, an actual donkey. Banners, bell ringers, holy water, incense, basically anything that you could take out of the church at some point made its way into the Palm Sunday procession. In Venice, doves were released during the Gloria Laus. In many places, the procession stopped at least 4 places in what was called a statio, and this will be another important liturgical word that we'll come back to, after the Latin word for to stand, for responsories and hymns. So as you can see, there was a great diversity in ceremonial forms. Most of all that stuff was already gone by 1570, so it's just all kind of, disappeared. Now, here's our conclusion here. Many people take their palms home with them on Palm Sunday Mass and put it behind the crucifix above their bed at home. A powerful reminder of the marriage bed as a place of sacrifice in the domestic church. Those palms are traditionally brought to church to be burnt after the Epiphany to prepare ashes for Ash Wednesday. I don't know if I've told some of you this story. My first Ash Wednesday, I had this hilarious thing happen. I was at St. Mary's. I get a phone call, And it is this Pentecostal preacher woman who asked me, and this is like Ash Wednesday, right? Where y'all get y'all ashes from? I'm just like, wait, what? I'm just like, what kind of question is this, right? I'm like, well, we get them from the palms. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, we get them from the palms. She said, well, how do you do that? I said, well, you burn your palms. And she's thinking like I'm talking like this. And she's like, what? I said, you got to burn your palms to get ashes for Ash Wednesday. And I said, or you can also find them on the internet, but right now it's a little difficult. So if you need ashes for today, then come over and we'll give you some ashes. So, so in a great ecumenical gesture, I gave a Pentecostal congregation ashes for Ash Wednesday, which it was a thing for them, but apparently it wasn't that congregation. So, the prayers attached to the traditional blessings led to a perception of palms as sacramentals powerful in warding off evil. That's why, palms, because of the prayers that were attached to them, people were like, wow, this stuff can do some serious stuff for you. So palms were put in, above the marriage bed, in cars, wherever you go. Now, even though the Reformed rites have lost much of the dramatic imagery and contrast of the Jerusalem rite, as experienced by Egedia in the 4th century, and in an attenuated form until 1969, there's still vestiges of it even today. And so I can't think of a better way to close than by quoting from the third blessing during the consecratory canon of the Missa Sica of the Palm Sunday blessing. The branches of palm signify his triumphs over the prince of death, and the branches of olive proclaim the coming of a spiritual anointing. For that blessed company of men understood that our Redeemer, with compassion for human misery, was about to fight with the prince of death for the life of the whole world, and by dying, to triumph. And we also, with full faith, retaining this as done and signified, humbly beseech thee that we may become victorious over the empire of death and deserve to be partakers in his glorious resurrection. That's Holy Week. All right, so thank you to Ms. Lewis for all of that wonderfulness. Okay, so questions about Holy Week, Palm Sunday. Yes? Right. Okay, so the question is, why was there so much change in that particular point of time? Right. Well, okay, so remember that in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, you have what was called the liturgical movement. And what was called the liturgical movement. And so there were pastors and scholars, theologians, liturgists, who really wanted the people to enter into the liturgy for it to come alive. And there was two different kind of schools of thought. One was we need to educate the people as much as possible to enter into the liturgy we have. And the other was we need to kind of simplify things and make them as accessible as possible so that the people can enter into them, right? Around the time of Pius XII, there were these kind of calls for change became very loud. And at a certain point, Pius XII started putting together these committees to look at the rites themselves. To say, okay, what are the things that we really need to kind of look at here? What are the things that nobody understands anymore? What are the things that we need to kind of make more accessible? So a lot of the changes that happened at Vatican II, right, from 1962 to 1965, were part of that kind of mix. But some of those things were happening already before. The committee, because remember that in the Vatican, you have kind of a central organization for making sure that everybody worships properly. It's called the Congregation for Divine Worship. And the Congregation for Divine Worship was really just kind of remember we talked about the liturgical movement had these two different kind of schools. They were very much in the first school, that we need to educate the people how to enter into the liturgy, because they were afraid that if you start changing stuff all over the place, it's going to be a freak show and a free-for-all. But Pius XII was of the idea that, okay, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but maybe we need to look at these things. And so he accepted a number of recommendations that were made, but it came about very incrementally. And then he died in the midst of all of it. So then you had John the 23rd, who was kind of in two directions at one time. John the 23rd loved all the old ceremonies. And in fact, in the papal chapel, he never did the Pius the 12th Holy Week. He just kept doing the old stuff because he was like, I don't like the new stuff. But he realized the pastoral need in certain places for a simplification of the rites. Then, remember, in 1964, you have permission for the vernacular. So you have English for the first time being celebrated as a liturgical language, which meant that all these things had to be translated, music had to be thought of, and so things started changing. But the 1955 kind of reforms were kind of an interim, because the church was still kind of trying to figure out, well, what should this look like? The interesting thing is, the 1969, the 1970, the stuff that we have now, is much more kind of internally coherent, I think, than the 1955 reforms. And we'll see that as we go through. Because again, and there was a guy who was around at the time named Léon Gaumier, who was one of those people who, the people who wanted to change stuff were like, oh, this is just an old fuddy-duddy who doesn't want to change anything. But he was very kind of acerbic in certain things by saying, okay, people, don't change stuff until you know why it's there in the first place. Because if you don't understand why it's there, then you're going to start changing stuff and making things totally incoherent. So when you read what Léon Gaumier, who was the master of ceremonies to the Pope, I mean, he was vicious about the reforms, because he's like, this is the stupidest, especially like the changing vestments 3,000 times in different colors. He was like, this is absurd and impractical. But the church at the time was struggling with, okay, how do we re-envision certain things of the rites? The Missa Sica for Palm Sunday, right? 45 minutes, all in Latin, lots of prayers which duplicate each other, right? In the middle of the 20th century, there were a lot of people saying, why are we doing this? Why are we sitting around for a fifth blessing? Can't you just bless it and go on with things, right? And so there was enough of that momentum by which the official reforms were like, okay, we just need to kind of, reduce this a little bit. With any reform, you have certain things which are positive, right? Because, think about how now that the Mass is in the vernacular, there are many people who have access to the ceremonies in a way that they might not have had before. But we've also lost a lot of symbolism and beautiful things, like the Planctus tone, that have just kind of disappeared. So now, the church is kind of in this process of, okay, now that we've done the reform, now do we need to look back and say, okay, maybe we've lost a few things that we need to restore. But that is a thing that, is a very long process. So, yeah, excellent question. Other